Hello? There's a little bit of a delay, I believe. This is actually my first time streaming, so I have no idea whether or not this is fully working. Cool, awesome. Thank you guys. How you guys doing? Can someone tell me how long this delay seems to be? I think like from when you guys send the message to when I respond. Awesome. Okay. Sound quality is good? You guys can hear me okay? It's not like a audio delay or anything like that, or not delay, but I guess like crackling. Awesome. Cool. Well, thank you guys for helping me out set up this stream. This is I actually didn't know it was so hard to, well, I guess hard to get started with streaming on Twitch. I thought it would just be like a button and then it would work. Hello. Okay, so I won't actually get to the questions that were asked inside of the discussion of the week until about 12 p.m., so in about 9 minutes or so. But if you guys have any questions, maybe outside of what I'll cover, I can take some time and answer some of those as well. Hello. Maybe there's some more questions. Have I tried React testing libraries? So I've used Jest and Enzyme, and they're pretty good. Generally, with testing, you'll see later on in the course that like testing components and testing the application is much more complicated than just the syntax. It's very easy to learn what testing components is like, especially with React and the way that we write our components, especially the way that we've taught it in this course, where you try and keep your components very like single responsibility. And in a way, you ideally try and write functional components because having class components that need to handle local state is a little bit complicated to test. It's not like crazy, but it is harder to maintain. So with React and Enzyme, it's actually very easy to test these individual components. The only concern is that there's like a kind of paradigm shift you have to have regarding testing. That will definitely cover. It's just testing is a very complicated topic beyond just like what is like how do I write a test here, right? Because you, in a way, the easiest way to think about testing is that you want to test the recipe. You don't want to test the ingredients. And a lot of the times I find that people end up testing ingredients because like you can make sure that this component in isolation tests and does the things that you expect it to do. But then in the scheme of an application with all these moving parts and all these things that might change, it suddenly doesn't work the way that you might expect it to. And I know that right now it might seem very abstract, especially people coming new to web development or coming new to React without having worked on a large application. But it's a good thing to keep in mind regarding testing because people get really kind of zeroed in on the fact that, oh my God, I got to know testing. Everyone talks about test-driven development. I need to know all these things about how to write tests properly. But there's lots of companies that are going to, like testing, I'm not going to lie to you guys, like in a lot of companies, testing is almost like an afterthought for them because they're trying to compete at a business level. So from a business level, they need to build features and they need to get the application out. And then like actually having everything properly tested becomes not as important. So I'm not saying that testing is not important. Testing is incredibly important, especially on enterprise, right? When you need like almost 100% uptime. When it comes to that, then testing is super crucial. But at that point is when you really need to understand like philosophically what the tests need to do. 360p support in your streams, internet slow. Yes. So let me do that. Let me just figure out how to do that actually. I'm completely new to Twitch. I have no idea how you change the options for how fast it goes. Oh, okay. Okay. So maybe I don't have that option yet because I just made this channel. Sorry, Rama. I wish I could help you. Okay. Would you guys prefer I do that? I can definitely stop the stream and then broadcast in 360p, I think. Hmm. Oh, is that ping? Is that ping? Is that what you guys are talking about? Let me maybe see here inside of my OBS. Maybe there's a. Dang, I actually don't really know how to. Huh. Oh, is that high? Does that mean that it's really slow? Okay. So I do plan to do this a couple times. Okay, 532p. Oh, that's weird. Okay. Okay. So okay, so I do plan to do like a stream once a week, so I can answer some questions. I can show you guys some code alongs, right? Especially for a little bit more, even just like general topics that might be more advanced in React or even more nuanced in React. I figure that something like this kind of office hours kind of situation would be really good. So maybe I can figure out how the stream quality works in the next video. If the video is poor, it will mostly just be me talking. So hopefully it'll be good for you guys. Sorry, I wish I spent all day yesterday trying to figure out Twitch, but it's a little bit more complicated than I actually thought it would be. Yes, the streams are going to be saved. Every stream is being recorded, so I will post them all for everyone regarding any of the questions. Awesome. Thank you. Cool. No, but thank you guys so much. I'm actually super blown away from all the responses that I got. I just joined this community, and it's like so overwhelming. This community is amazing. Everyone's so supportive, everyone's so welcoming. It's such an incredible thing to be a part of. I just really hope to be able to speak to all of you guys. You know, I know there's so many. There's like 42,000 people, but I really want to help everyone. If anyone has any questions at all, you know, I'm 100% like committed to helping everyone understand React and Redux, right? Before this, I was actually an instructor for a nonprofit. I was like the lead TA in Toronto, if anyone's ever in Toronto. So I had experience doing instructing there, and I found it was like one of the most rewarding things to do. So I would love to be able to, give back to this incredible community however I can, because web development really changes like people's lives at this point. It's this huge wave right now that can completely give you a brand new opportunity, and it really just comes down to like yourself, right? As well as the people that can help you. Yeah, okay, I can definitely do that. So I am actually, okay, we're like 30 seconds away, so I can start the AMA now. I have the questions inside of the discussion of the week. So I will definitely answer that first. So, okay, so I come from a background actually in fitness. I was originally in university studying political science and philosophy, and I was pre-law in that sense. So I had done some of the LSATs, and I'd been studying for my LSATs for like 2, 3 years because my goal was to be a lawyer. And I liked the LSATs. I thought they were really logical in structure, the way that you kind of had to figure out what the solution would be based on these logic games and reading comprehension. So I thought that that was what law was going to be. And I was completely wrong, because after the LSAT, once I started doing an internship at a law firm out here in Toronto, I found out that the job was completely different. Every single person I was talking to was telling me that I should do something else with my career. So I, at the time, was running a gym with a partner back from, he was like a strength and conditioning coach from BYU in Hawaii. And he had been born with this weird bone disorder so that he couldn't actually do any of the lifting. So we were working together, and we owned a gym, and I was training athletes in Toronto. Oh, that's cool. So that's what happened to me. And along the way, I actually learned how to Olympic lift off of YouTube. And this is like back in 2009, 2010. So at the time, like there's a lot of complexity to how you actually do the exercises. And I injured my back. I had developed like a minor case of sciatica when I was like 22 years old. And I was like, man, it's crazy. I'm like 22, and I might be completely like too injured, and I'm so young. So what I did was, at the time, we needed to build a website for the actual facility, and we didn't really know anything at all about like web development, any of the people in the actual. I didn't even know that Facebook was a company at that time. Like, I knew that Facebook was an application, and I knew that you could use it. I had no idea that there was money in this industry. So I was just like, okay, cool. Like, I guess I'll just start figuring out how to set up a website on like WordPress after some Googling. But like, it couldn't do the things that we wanted to do for the website. So what I ended up doing was that I was at this party, and I met this guy who was the CEO of Bitmaker, who's like, it's like a boot camp for like web development. And he was telling me that you could easily like find a job after doing a boot camp and learning some of the stuff. And this was about 6 years ago now. And I was like, okay, whatever. I have nothing to lose, right? So I sold some of my shares in the company, like back to the person. And he gave me, or sorry, I took the money that I sold some of the shares I had in the company. And then I bought the boot camp. And with that, I learned Ruby on Rails first. So I learned like some full stack. I didn't actually really learn that much JavaScript. But with the bootcamp knowledge, I at least understood the industry, that there was all this money involved in this thing. And you didn't really need a degree in order to get a job that could pay 6 figures. So that was enough for me to be like, oh, I'm interested. And the only thing that the boot camp was valuable for was that it made me work on it for 8 hours a day for like 3 months. I just had to like focus on learning how to code for 3 months. And I think that that's the only valuable thing actually. If you actually have the kind of work ethic to learn it yourself, like it's entirely possible without the boot camp, because there's so many resources now that are either free or completely like our course or any of Andre's courses. They're all like actually very, very cheap relative to the amount of information and the like access to this community that you get. I wish I had something like this ZTM community when I first started, because I had so many questions that I just couldn't get answered when I first started learning. Um, but after I did the boot camp, I actually started a small company with another guy that I met in the boot camp, and we were trying to help teachers and students learn English through this platform we were building. And this was all on Ruby on Rails still. But like that's why I realized like, oh my god, this industry is crazy, because it was actually really hard. Like building it was one thing and getting it to work was one thing, but then actually the marketing, all the business around it was like completely different. It was an entirely different animal. And after that was when I was like, okay, I should probably level up my skills. I really need to learn like how to actually be a professional developer. So what I ended up doing was I went to sorry, General Claw. So I'm just telling about my backstory. Maybe, yeah, yeah. I will post this stream back online so everyone can see it. Um, but yeah, I was saying that I'm at this point where I just finished my boot camp. I tried to start this little company, and it didn't really work out from a business standpoint. So I was like, okay, I got to become a professional developer. I need to find my first job, which I think is the most probably pressing thing for a lot of people here that are taking this course is how do I get my first job? And I want to spend some time with this. The bootcamp I did was Bitmaker. It's out in Toronto. It's now owned by General Assembly, which is a really popular one, I think based out in San Francisco. But when I was looking for my first job, I talked to a lot of people who were already professional developers. And they all told me that there's two main things you got to do. You got to ask everyone you can, knock on as many doors as you can, and say, hey, I am ready to learn. I honestly don't really know that much, but I am extremely eager, and will you give me a chance? And then the second thing, of course, is that you should always be trying to improve, always trying to learn. Yes, and that's the thing, is that the first job is 100% the hardest one. The hardest job to get is the first one. Of course, like getting into Google is probably just as difficult no matter what point in your career is, but like that first job is the most overwhelming. It's that period of time where you're trying to get people to just believe that they can take this chance on you. And what I did is I actually took a free internship. Like I did this interview at this small startup called SkyPrep. And I did the interview and they didn't get back to me in like 2 weeks. So what I did was I emailed them back and I said, hey, like I'm really, really eager. I really like what you guys are doing. And I'm willing to work for free. I just want an opportunity to get some experience. That's all I'm looking for. Will you give me a chance, right, to at least maybe just get some experience and get my foot in the door? And they were like, yeah, sure. You know what? Like, come back in and let's at least see if you can try and do some stuff like that. So with that, yeah, so that's the thing. I think like for a lot of people, there's two different camps. Some people think that you shouldn't take a free internship because like a lot of the skills you have, you deserve to be paid for. And I 100% agree. But the nature of the business of web development is that there's a lot of people coming in to the industry now. There's a lot of jobs available, 100%. There's so many jobs, and like web development is only getting bigger. There's so much need for it. But a lot of companies like are at different stages of the business as well. So some companies are willing to take on new interns, new developers who are just hungry because all they're looking for, all they want is just to be able to take someone in because they have a hard time getting the actual like senior developers that they actually need to start the startup. And those are great opportunities because they probably have some funding and maybe they're able to pay you. But then there is another side of this where you have lots of large enterprise companies that are looking for junior developers as well. And at those companies, there's only maybe 2-3 positions available every quarter, but those are the ideal ones you get into, and they'll pay you right away, right? One of my coworkers at a company that Andre and I worked at, actually, she was a developer that just came out of a boot camp as well, but she was making a significantly high salary for considering her just coming out of boot camp. But the thing is that it just all depends on negotiating, a little bit of luck, actually quite a bit of luck, and a lot of just navigating the business side of this industry. Because as much of it as it is based on what you know technically, 50% of it is going to be based on how well you're able to socialize. Like you can make up for a lot of it if you understand what the business of this industry requires, because tech is a business. These companies are doing this because they want to make money, right? So if you can demonstrate to them that you come from a non-traditional background, so in that sense you have a lot to offer to them that is not just technical, that is how you will be able to get in, at least pique their interest, because they're going to see that, oh my god, this guy at the very least might have other skills, right? We'll give him time to develop their skills, or her, sorry, don't want to just completely exclude females. This person is completely at least they have a lot of other characteristics to offer. So I was at the startup for about 18 months. And while I was there, like, there are a lot of things with startups that actually are, like, at least I find with startups, is that if this startup has not ever been successful before, like if it was not founded by people that had sold startups before, you end up going through a lot of issues. And if you can't figure out those issues, like, it's honestly, you'll find that that will delay your growth in your career. I did have a mentor. You'll find that there's a lot of people that are willing to mentor you inside of these companies. Yes, so I did get paid. After 3 days of my unpaid internship, they offered me a full-time position. Or sorry, they offered me part-time, and then 5 days later, they offered me full-time. Because I was working like 14 hours, right? So they saw that I was working really hard and I was trying. And I was extremely eager to learn. I had no ego, and if I got things wrong, like, I was like, oh, that's totally fine. It's part of the process. Can I to ask you to give me some of your time to explain to me why I couldn't get this right? So I spent like 18 months just learning and trying to build things, right? Because they would give them to me. They would give these projects to me for me to build. Like, I had to learn Angular on my own, Angular 1. And I was like the only person coding out this brand new web application they were trying to pivot to. So, it's kind of like that discomfort that you get thrown into in your first job that will really make you in a certain way. And I definitely suggest you find a mentor. It's actually very easy as long as you join a company that has somebody that is more advanced than you are, because this industry is actually phenomenal in the sense that everyone is really helpful. Like, it's really easy to find people that want to mentor. And it's a very, very valuable thing to be a lifelong learner, because for people who come from a non-traditional background, the main thing that you're missing is not actually the development side of it. Because in computer science, generally, you're not learning JavaScript, nor are you learning web architecture. What you're being exposed to is computer science. And computer science is probably the biggest thing that, if you want to get into like one of these top 5 tech companies like Microsoft, Amazon, Google, these extremely competitive, like San Francisco-based Silicon Valley tech companies, Google for sure needs you to know computer science, because they have a really hard false positive style of testing candidates. So they are looking for the best of the best, right? They want you to be the absolute best. But like, again, interviewing, I also want you guys to completely remember this. The technical interview is in no way a reflection of how good you are as a developer. The actual technical interview is the HR method of trying to figure out whether or not you can handle facing a CS question, or sorry, a development question, and then how you solve it. So everybody has a different lens, right? Just because you're bad at like one interview does not mean that you are a bad developer and you don't deserve that job. It's completely unrelated. If you can show that you have this grit and this willingness, you can definitely get a job. You can definitely get a job, right? A lot of people turn it around even though they flunk the interview because they show their persistence, they show their willingness to learn, and they show that eagerness. So that's a huge thing for a lot of recruiters because they want that. They want somebody who's committed to learning because they also understand that their technical interview is flawed. Now, in Google's interview process is extremely, like, it's arduous. So my girlfriend just got a job at Twitch in San Francisco, and you do need to be a software engineer. They are mainly looking for you inside of all of their interviews. They want you to know algorithms. So Andre has a great course on algorithms, right? It's a great introduction to all the algorithms. But they want you to know it because like if you think about Google, they're rarely building new front end things. Most of what they're doing is they're trying to optimize and they want to deliver faster results because Google's main product is data and information. They're trying to figure out how to optimize delivering data, receiving data, processing data, right? Breaking that information down into usable things because the way that Google makes money is through ads. They want to be able to process all of these bits and information that they don't know what it represents and turn it into something that will generate revenue. So that's why algorithms is so important for Google. And I definitely think that like everybody should gun for Google if they want. But understand that it's not the end all be all, right? Just because you don't get into Google, I don't want you to be discouraged. And how you get into Google also depends on your career trajectory. A lot of the times people get into Google because they've had enough experiences where they happen to stumble upon the right things in the projects that they took on, right? Like so much of it has to do, so much of it has to do with just what you're able to learn and what you're able to experience. And honestly, the first, I would say, 2-3 years of your career, you just want to make sure that you are in a position where you're able to learn at a pace that does not discourage you. Because there's this state that you can get in when you're learning, which is called flow. There's actually a book on this. And the way that you can distill it down is that when you're learning, if you're learning something that you're already comfortable with, you're not really challenged. And in that sense, you're not really learning. Or you're not learning at the pace you want to be. If you're too challenged, however, it gets really discouraging because it's like you don't even know where to begin, right? Like you look at this thing and none of it makes sense. So you want to be in this place where it's just above your current threshold, but not so much that you're completely discouraged. And when you're learning in that place as much as possible, that's where you are able to grow the absolute fastest. And yeah, that's the one. So that's one of the big things. So in terms of projects, honestly, here's the thing. Like, you want to work on, so I'm going to give you guys a pretty, I guess, structured answer or fleshed out answer in multiple ways. So on the technical side, you want to learn more and more about how to build applications that are secure and that are like fully functioning and follow best practices. And that you'll only encounter when you actually build something and see the problems. I think when you see solutions without understanding the problem, you don't really understand the solution. For example, we look at unidirectional data flow inside of React. It's like a huge thing that we talk about in this course because unidirectional data flow is a response that React went through when they looked at how Angular 1 was built. Angular 1 had two-way data flow. right? And I know for a lot of you guys, if you guys haven't like taken this course yet, maybe it seems confusing, but I'll try and explain this as best as possible. You have data that is being displayed, but you also have data that's being modified by the user through the UI. This means that at some point, if this data is shared in multiple places on your web page, if the user modifies it in one place and this other place is trying to look at that same piece of data, there's a chance that the data here is not fully synchronized, which means that you get a chance that there's race conditions inside of your application where the data is out of sync with each other. And if that happens, you can see how your application could break. And this was like how Angular 1 did it, because Angular 1 was the first single page application. Whereas with React saw this and they were like, oh, okay, like, you know what, this is a problem because it leads to a lot of bugs and it leads to applications breaking when they're built this way. So we're going to make sure that all of the data comes from one single source. If you update any data, we are going to refresh the entire application anywhere that's listening to this data. And we're going to prioritize updating that data first. So you always have one single source of truth that generates all of the views that your application is comprised of. Hopefully that makes sense. I know that's like really technical, but the main takeaway here is that even like when you hear that, like when I heard that for the first time, I didn't understand what that meant because I'd never experienced the problems of two-way data flow. I didn't understand the problem that it was trying to solve. I could hear it and I could logically understand what's happening, but I couldn't empathize with the problem. I didn't know what it was like as a developer to have to encounter this kind of issue. Therefore, I didn't fully understand the solution. It wasn't until I built my own Angular 1 project that I saw my application breaking all over the place and I was dealing with all these bugs that I could not figure out why, that when I finally moved on to React, it all made sense. It like hit me completely and I was like, oh my God, now I remember when I was trying to build this feature, I didn't understand why these bugs were this way. And when that happens, you completely understand why these things are this way. But the theory here is that you need to understand the problem in order to understand the solution. And the great thing is that even though like we're learning React now, and like everyone knows, like even Angular 2, Vue, right, React, or whatever framework, most of them all follow unidirectional data flow now because they understand the problem that two-way data flow brings. So you might live in this world now, right? But that doesn't mean that you need to understand the problems of two-directional data flow because like encountering that problem doesn't net you that much positivity because the entire environment is now in unidirectional data flow. So what you want to do is you just want to work on a lot of projects that are challenging because then you'll actually encounter issues so that when you see a solution, you'll be able to think, oh, you know what? This solution actually solves a problem that I fully understand. So once that understanding is there through like your bones in that way, like that's really where the understanding comes, right? Because the technical understanding is only one thing, and that's really easy. The syntax, right? Like Googling documentation, you will get good at that no matter what, because that's just what it is as a developer to develop the technical skill of that. But then the side that you need to work on for yourself, that I found at least, for me, that brought me the most success, was that I tried to really empathize with the problem that this solution is trying to solve. And the only way that I did that was to try and build things. And the thing about building things is that it's really hard to be motivated to build your own thing on your own because, like, at least for me, I just couldn't figure out what it is that I want to build. And everyone says find a passion project, whatever. And there's lots of ways to do that, right? I know a lot of guys and girls inside of our community at ZTM do open source, which is a really great way to actually just get involved and try and see something you've never seen before, read some code you never read before, look at a problem space and look at a part of the web or even like some libraries that you've never touched before, right? And it's intimidating like crazy. But it's a great way to just get exposed to problems because at the very least, like you've now encountered an issue. So hopefully that is helpful. I know that's really long-winded. It's actually kind of odd, like me being the only person talking in this conversation. I know you guys are chatting, But I guess only hearing my own voice. Um, Sorry, let me read some of these questions. Just adding on. But how did Andre approach to teach this course? So when I was, it's actually interesting. So when I was trying to do, so when I was at the company that me and Andre have worked with, which was a company called Wrangle, we were a consultancy as well as a development shop. So we were like software architecture consultants. And I'm 20. I just turned 27. Actually, no, sorry, I'm turning 28 in October. Wow, it's been quite a while already. And I was living in Amsterdam as a remote developer, right? So I was a remote developer working for Wrangle, and there was a visa issue with how I was being employed by my company because of the company that I was working with as their lead consultant. So I was consulting for this tech company out in Spain called Roche. It's a pharmaceutical company, but I was doing I was helping them work on their new platform that they were trying to build. But there were some issues with the way that my visa was being worked on when I was in Canada. So I was faced with this dilemma where I had to either leave the country, so leave Amsterdam, and come back to Canada in order to continue working at Wrangle, or I had to stay in Amsterdam and wait until July, but I had to leave Wrangle. So that's what I decided to do because my girlfriend was living in Amsterdam. She had gotten a job there. That's why we moved in the first place. And I couldn't just pick up and leave my life because I had 2 days to make this decision. So I was like, okay, you know what? Like, let me just figure out something, right, while we're here. And what ended up happening was that I was actually looking at making another course for personal training or like for weight loss, right? Because I was like, okay, I have this time, right? I might as well do something that is pretty quick and will keep me busy. So then, like, luckily, I had another coworker that got approached by Andre because Andre was looking for somebody to do this React course. And then they approached me and told me that, hey, Andre's looking. Do you want to talk to Andre? Right? Because I and this person had worked on that um, nonprofit teaching women how to code thing that I was telling you guys about earlier. And that's how I actually got involved with Andre, because Andre was like, hey, I've got this like great course, this great series called Zero to Mastery. Are you curious? Or if you're interested, I'm looking for an instructor to build a React course. And I was like, yeah, totally. I'm 100% down, right? Because at the time I was looking to do some teaching myself, and I had been missing that rewarding experience of being an instructor and like mentoring students that I got out of that nonprofit experience that I had done for like a year and a half in Toronto. So this was kind of the outcome. And the experience has been amazing, right? Like it was really time consuming for sure. It was like 4 months of my life was just all building this course for you guys. And it's extremely nerve wracking just walking into this community but it's been such a warm welcome and everyone's so nice, right? I just hope that I'm able to get to all your questions, and have a good interaction with everybody. I just hope everyone feels supported, right? Like I want to contribute to this community in a positive way. So, if there's anything you guys, have questions about, like throughout this process, if you're frustrated, like definitely reach out to me. I will try my best to, answer any of your questions that you guys would have. 100%. Yeah. Follow me on Twitter, reach out to me. This is pretty much mostly what I do actually on social media. I, um, So let me see if there's other kinds of questions because I do want to answer some more of these questions as well. Like we can talk about a lot of stuff. So my Twitter handle here, I'll just type it in here maybe. Okay, so other questions. Let's see. So how about let's do some technical questions that maybe I can answer without getting too technical. So one thing is that there's a question here that says, can GraphQL fully push out Redux from our project when it comes to state? Actions management if we work with Apollo server on the back end. Okay. Oh, sorry. What was your question? Thank you for the course. Oh. Silicon Valley. Yes, yes. So, okay. So I guess I'll definitely get to that. You know what? I'll get to this question about Silicon Valley since we're here right now, and I'm talking about career. Okay, so Silicon Valley, it depends on what company you want to get to. Um, if you want to go to a tech company in, okay, so in Silicon Valley, it's a little different. Silicon Valley is the epicenter of all technology. Every single person wants to go to Silicon Valley. Every senior developer, every developer in the world generally knows that if you want to like flourish and completely be set for life, Silicon Valley is the place to go. Even if that's not true, that's the general perspective that people have. So the amount of competition is really crazy. If that's the case, you have to look at the type of companies that are in Silicon Valley because Silicon Valley is like any tech city. There's going to be startups of varying degrees of success. There's going to be middle-sized companies of varying sizes of success, and there's going to be enterprise, like big companies of varying levels of success, right? So everyone thinks about Silicon Valley and they think like Airbnb, Uber, Google, Microsoft, Facebook, right? Like you think of all the big tech companies, and these guys are looking for the best. Like they want you to know a lot and they want you to be like a high cut above. And you can definitely get there. Don't get me wrong, right? Like 100%. But you just got to understand that they're going to be less forgiving of mistakes in the interview process. I don't want this to be discouraging in any way, but I think it's best that you understand the nature of what these companies are expecting. So they might hit you with computer science questions. They might ask you really advanced web questions that go way beyond syntax, right? They might be asking you processing questions. They might just be asking you questions to see how you think inside of a logical structure. So they might give you a question where and these questions are going to be like really difficult. They'll be like on an 8x8 chess grid. There is a wizard in the like third square from the top right, and then there's your character from the bottom left at like the fourth square at the bottom. What combination is the how many efficient combinations are there for you to reach that wizard? And you have to do that figuring out through code. So like it's like these really, really convoluted and complex questions that you have to solve, keeping in mind like algorithms, keeping in mind like it transcends just like the kind of statements that we write, right? So that's the kind of coding that like a lot of these big like tech companies are expecting. But it also depends on the role. Like a lot of them like don't really hire for front end development the same way that they hire for like software engineers or front end engineers. But then you might also encounter like different roles. A lot of the time, you just know what the role is called. Like in Google, they have a role called UI engineer, where you need to know a little bit of UX, right? Like user experience. My girlfriend is a user experience designer, so that's another thing to keep in mind. She's a product designer. She's not a developer. But do understand that the tech companies in Silicon Valley are definitely a little bit stricter with their requirements as well as the kind of questions you get. So even beyond that, though, there's also going to be like smaller startups, right? So a lot of startups end up getting acquired by big companies. If a startup has gone through that acquisition process, that means that they've made a lot of connections in the industry from an investment standpoint. And that also means that they've made a lot of like understanding about how to navigate the industry. If that's the case, that's a good startup to work for because they can easily find and hire senior talent. Because the most important thing for a startup is to have a very solid starting group of senior talent. That senior talent is one going to know how to actually properly enforce and build the product in the best way so that if they bring on junior developers, they'll be able to level them up appropriately as well as set them up for success. Because the most important thing you want is to be set up for success. Those startups are going to be a little bit more challenging to get into because they are also looking for talent. But the thing to keep in mind is that you should always apply because you don't know what their hiring process is. You also don't know what product they're building. A lot of people are interested in building the product itself. Like they want to build something because they relate or empathize with the business goal. The other thing is that, like, in that sense, if the product is not really like sexy, right? If they're building something in an industry where it's not really, popular, or it's something that people haven't heard of, you might have an easier chance to get a job there. But these are companies that could have been very successful and end up being sold for like 100 million, $200 million, right? Like, it's a lot of it is just understanding and navigating that realm of Silicon Valley tech business. Because the technical business of Silicon Valley, they're leading the way. They're like the innovators. They understand everything about how the business of technology goes. So if that's the case, you kind of have to integrate yourself with the mentality there, or you have to be like a superstar developer. So like, it's going to be a mix of those two, and then it's also going to come down to luck, as well as like finding the position, right? Getting into contact with the right people. And honestly, I remember reading that like a lot of companies, like these big tech companies that everyone wants to get into, they have maybe a 3% organic adoption rate, which means that they only hire 3% organically. Everything else is through recommendation. So you need to be recommended by somebody that the company knows, right? Who's already inside the company and has a history of working with them. Silicon Valley is definitely a good goal. Like, I definitely think so, but don't be discouraged if you can't get into it in, I'd even say, the first 3-4 years of your career, right? Like, understand that like it's extremely intimidating. It's extremely difficult. Like, just because you get into those companies too doesn't mean that it's like a smooth sailing from there, right? Like, companies like Apple, or companies like, there's tech companies that expect you to work insane amounts of hours just by the nature of it, because, right, everyone wants to work there. If you don't want to do this, we can hire like 2,000 other applicants that are waiting. So that's another thing, is that understand that, like, if you want that experience, you got to know what you're getting with that experience as well, and understand if that's the right thing for you, because work-life balance is very important. Yeah, so that's the main thing there. But sorry, let me get back to some of these other questions regarding architecture and code. So I guess, like, is are you guys comfortable with me moving on to more of the technical questions than these career questions? Like, I'm comfortable doing both, like 100%. Okay. 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 So with GraphQL. GraphQL is a new paradigm that is shifting mostly how we do the connection between the front end and the back end. It's on both sides. So if you want to set up a GraphQL server for your database to actually accept GraphQL queries from the front end, so when you typically make a request with the traditional architecture of REST, you have these routes that are exposed to you, and each one serves a different purpose. Like, you make a post request if you want to update some data. You make a get request to a specific route if you want to get some data. You make a delete request to a different route if you want to delete some data there, right? And each of these routes, like, you have to list them all out. Like, enterprise applications, I've worked on applications that have thousands of routes, right? And what GraphQL wants to do is that it wants to eliminate all of this and give you one route. So you only end up hitting this one route in order for you to get all of the information that you want on your front end. Or if you want to make any requests to update any data, you all hit this one route. The other thing is that, like, usually when you request data, you get way too much data. You get more data than you actually need, because the data is pretty much just JSON objects, as we know with our front end. And like, a lot of the times, there's a ton of properties on there that you don't need, right? Like, you look at any of these default objects that you get from the browser, like, or inside of like the native DOM implementations, like, you'll see that there's hundreds of properties that you don't need. So like, that is computationally and performance wise expensive. So GraphQL has done it in such a way that you can query for only the properties that you want. Now, with Apollo, Apollo is a front-end client that you can use in order to make these queries more effectively to your backend server that has now been modified with GraphQL. Apollo client is, we'll actually learn Apollo client in our course. I actually completely replaced Redux with Apollo client inside of this course later on. It's one of the lesson chunks that gets released July 15th. It is fully capable of replacing Redux, but it is completely different from Redux. Because the implementation of storing data with GraphQL and handling queries and what they call mutations. So mutations is how you modify data on the back end. You have to learn how to write those same mutations and queries on the front end. Because with Apollo client, in order for it to replace Redux, Redux handles local state management on your front end, right? You have data on the back end, but you also have local data on the front end. And Redux is meant to handle local data on the front end. But Apollo client lets you cache data that you get from the backend and combine those queries together in the exact same way so that you can store local data with Apollo as well as update backend data with Apollo. But they both follow the GraphQL paradigm, meaning that you have to do things the GraphQL way. And remember, with everything, there's a trade-off. There's 100% a trade-off with every single decision you make. How senior you are as a developer is based on how well you're able to understand those trade-offs, as well as what those trade-offs mean for you 6 months from now, right? 2 weeks from now, 1 year from now, because that will change as the application grows, as new features come in, as features need to be changed. Like, you need to write your code in such a way that it's easy to change, and also for your team to be able to come in, read your code, understand what's happening, right? Everyone needs to have a shared best practice and knowledge of what to do. The biggest problem that with GraphQL, that Andre and I both have with GraphQL, is the complexity. There's a extremely high learning curve, and the entire company and team on both the front end and the back end need to buy into GraphQL in order to implement it. And like, you guys are really new to the industry, so you guys are all really thirsty, really hungry to learn. And that's an amazing, amazing characteristic. But there are going to be a lot of developers that are kind of settled in their ways, and they don't want to learn new technology because REST works, right? Billion-dollar companies have been built on REST. They've never implemented GraphQL, right? Like, yes, from a certain standpoint, it's like, well, this technology could make things easier. We could net like many positive gains in the future if we switch over now. But then from a business standpoint, they're like, well, how much time do we have to give you, right? Like, how much time does it take to migrate this entire backend over to GraphQL? And somebody might be like, well, it'll take a team of 8 to 10 that will have to figure out, yeah, exactly, migration and time, right? So they're like, well, you know what? I don't really want to pay you for that. We need new features because our stakeholders are telling us that we need to build this new feature to compete because profits were not that good like last quarter. So there's all of these like massive things about the business of tech that will influence the decision of whether or not this thing gets adopted. And a lot of what you end up learning is going to actually, like, in your decision of whether or not this thing is valuable to learn will be based on whether or not this thing is actually, from a business perspective, valuable, if it comes down to getting your job. Yeah. So that's the thing with GraphQL. Like, I think it's really interesting. Like, it's shaking up the industry of the front end because people are so curious about what it means, right? Because it's this brand new way of doing things. So everybody is just so interested and wants to talk about it. But a lot of that noise is coming from people that are not working with it at a large scale. There are smaller companies that are successful that have implemented it, but they're able to do so because when you're small, you can pivot quickly, right? It's very easy for you to move from one technology to another with much shorter time than what you expect with a larger enterprise company that has a hard time, making such a large scale kind of decision, such as completely changing the way that we architect our applications and integrations between front and back end. Like, a lot of that is kind of going to be the complexity with it. But you can 100% replace Redux with Apollo client. Like, it's totally doable. It's just, and I'll teach you guys how to do it in this course. It's just, from a business perspective, is that actually going to be something that is worth doing? So the Redux patterns are Personally, I prefer Redux a lot because one, it's been around for so long that you can pretty much get any question you need answered. People have gone through it numerous times now, and they've built really advanced, really scalable, really large applications with Redux. The teams behind Redux are also like some of the best developers in the world, right? Like Dan Abramov built Redux, and Dan is like probably the forefront person when it comes to React. So with Redux, it's scalable, and the best practices that I teach you guys in this course are fully scalable. So these are the things that will get you to actually understand and read and write and figure out how you need to write your code and design patterns to scale to an enterprise level, right? It's also really easy to read, easy to comprehend, right? From if you take a step back, like coding it is going to be challenging because learning Redux is probably the most difficult thing about Redux, just because there's so much configuration in the beginning where you have to integrate in all of the parts of Redux, because Redux is a paradigm of handling your data. So just understanding like what's the store, right? What are actions? Where is this dispatch coming from? How do I connect my component to it? How do I break up my components, right? So that they're reusable. Like all of this stuff is a thing that is the most challenging about learning Redux in the beginning. But the more you do it, the more it makes sense. Redux is definitely one of those things where you don't have to understand it 100% to like follow along and write it. Because once you start actually taking what you've learned and trying to do it and write it, you will start to make those connections mentally, right? It's just a matter of understanding this thing. Yeah, so that's my views on Redux versus Apollo. Like I've worked on one project with it, and I liked it, like Apollo and GraphQL, like as far as what it did on the back end. But having to work with new developers and leveling them up on Apollo was way more challenging. I think once you grasp Redux, it's pretty easy to work with it. But once you grasp Apollo, there's still a lot of challenges because the community is really new. And that was my biggest concern with it. Yeah, no worries. If you have any questions at all, right, like ping me, ask me. Maybe I'll make a Redux channel actually, just because it's sometimes a little separated from React, especially if your questions are about Redux architecture and Redux flow as a whole, especially when you guys get to sagas. Sagas is definitely a really challenging thing, but I think it's incredibly valuable to learn. Um, so definitely, like ping me, guys, ask me questions. Right, I'm 100% ready to help you guys. So Redux Saga is a way to handle asynchronous events inside of Redux. So right now we leverage Redux for local state management of our application. But Redux Saga is when you want your application's side effects, meaning like anything that has to be asynchronous. So when you listen for user clicks, or when you need to make like a fetch request to a URL, when you want to get some data, modify that data before you actually store it into your local app state so you can use it in your components, that's when you want to use something like Redux Saga, Redux Thunk, or Redux Observable. So I've worked with RxJS. I actually like RxJS more than I like Redux Saga, because I actually built a couple applications in Angular 2 as well. And in Angular 2, there's no sagas. You have to use observables because the default Angular library is built on observables. But observables is also really challenging. I'd say it's way more challenging than sagas. But it's just, those libraries are purely for asynchronous event handling, which you guys will learn all about inside of this course as well. That's honestly, guys, when it comes to React and Redux and building applications in React and Redux, asynchronous event handling is probably like 60% of the challenge. It's the hardest part of Redux and React, is the asynchronous part of event handling inside of building React Redux applications. Because when you're building live applications, you rarely build an application that doesn't interface with the backend of some kind, right? There's always some kind of database that you work with, and there's always data is always live, right? Data is always changing. if that's the case, then asynchronous event handling is the biggest thing. I explained the observer pattern to you guys, and we do work with observables a little bit because Firebase's auth library works with observables, or at least the observer pattern. So you guys will learn it for sure. You won't work with RxJS though. RxJS is different from the observable pattern. The observable pattern is just the idea of how you get asynchronous data and how you manage it. But RxJS is a library that's built on top of using observables so that you can process the different streams of data that you're getting. So for example, if you have data coming in from a backend, like let's say we're building an instant chat messenger, and you have two main pieces of asynchronous data. You're talking to somebody and you don't know when that person's going to send messages to you. And you're writing data as well, and your application doesn't know when you're going to send messages to the user. But that chat messenger needs to display chronologically the messages that came in and the messages that you're typing out. You need a library like RxJS that will be able to merge those two separate asynchronous streams of data into one and then figure out chronologically what order they came in. Does that make sense? Yeah, you can do something like that with sagas as well. You can definitely do something like that with sagas as well. It's just you guys will see the code with sagas. It's a little different. It's more like async await, which you guys will also learn inside of this course. Hold on, let me see. Oh, okay. Here's a good question actually. What are the best practices for project structure? This is like folder styling, Redux, etc. So with folder structure, this is something that you'll have to figure out with your team when you join a project. When you're on your own, I can give you an opinion about that, but when you're working with a team, you guys have to agree together on what you want that folder structure to be. So there are two popular folder structure patterns that I've seen on projects. The first is where you keep all of your stuff inside the same folder if they're related to the same thing, which is what we do in our application. So for example, if we're building a component about user lists, I keep everything related to the presentational side, so the React side, inside of that user list folder. If I have Redux stuff that's related to user list, I have a separate Redux folder that holds all my Redux code, and then I'll make a folder that holds everything Redux related to that user list. So the reducer, the actions, the types, the sagas, any utilities that have to do with Redux inside of that folder, those will all happen inside of that folder. Because usually, when you're working on a project, you at most are working on one feature at a time. And that feature, if you've properly separated out everything, you will only jump between the files related to the front end of that code and the asynchronous event handling or the state management of that code. So Redux is going to handle the asynchronous stuff as well as the state management of that stuff. But then your component is going to be the presentational side of that thing. So that way, you know exactly where every single file you need to work with inside of the folder. Yes, the stream will 100% be available. So that's the main thing when it comes to folder structure. That's one way. The other way that I've seen is that you have folders that hold like all your reducers inside of one reducer folder. So instead of having individual folders that are segmented by the feature, you have individual folders that are segmented by the concept. So all reducers are inside of one folder. All components are inside of one folder. I don't really like this one because I find it's really hard to navigate and it gets really big and really, really arduous. But, you know, like it just depends on the project you join. Some people like that. So with state management inside of this application, so to be honest with you guys, I've built these type of applications so often that I'm generally pretty comfortable with e-commerce. I didn't have to think too hard about where data goes. And with Redux, you'll notice that you won't have to. When you're working only with local class components, you will have to think about your architecture, like your component tree, and where to put local state data. But once you have Redux, it completely separates that out. You just write your components to be presentational, meaning that they get data and then they display something. And then you write your Redux code that pulls the data from your Redux and then passes it to that presentational component. And that way now you've abstracted away the need to think about where inside of your application your data needs to sit. Because your application's data all now sits inside of Redux. The only place where you probably need to leverage local state if you're doing Redux properly is when you need to track something like that's completely isolated to the component. And that component, like there's no reason to move out or build out a Redux feature to store some data. And that is really just going to come down to experience. Like it's one of these things where like I might be explaining it, but maybe it doesn't like resonate right now. So like I love these questions. Like they're really really good and very in-depth questions. It's just a little hard to answer because it's so theoretical, if you guys know what I mean. So let me see. What's another question here? Okay, so while working with React, one question is that are there any hard and fast rules about passing down state as props and updating props from a child component? So what this means is that if we have some component that has local state, and inside of this component is a child component, if we pass down our set state inside of a function as a prop to this child component, what are the rules required to do this? The most important thing is probably make sure that your context of this is properly bound, which we go over pretty early inside of React Basics. And it's really easy with arrow functions. The only other rule that probably you should think about is if you have to pass this function down 2 or 3 children deep, you probably should consider using something like Redux or Context API. And the Context API is a new feature that got introduced in React like 16.6, which is maybe like October of last year. It's pretty easy to use once you get a firm grasp of kind of Redux's architecture, because it follows a very similar thing. It was actually React's response to Redux as to why they introduced Context API. In fact, React Redux uses Context API on the hood. It's been around for a long time. It's just in a stable version now that they're confident pushing forward for developers to use. I teach you guys how to use Context API to replace Redux inside the application as well. That's also later on in the course. But that's probably the main hard and fast rule because you don't want to prop drill down. So prop drilling is where you have a component that needs to pass a prop down 3 children deep or 4 children, like just many children deep. Because the components in between need to now suddenly be aware of this prop that you're trying to pass, even if they never use it. If the only thing they're doing is they're getting the prop so that they can hand it down to another child, that component is now too aware of something it doesn't really need. And ideally what we want to do is we want to write dumb components, right? We want components that don't really know anything other than the fact that I get some data, I'm going to do something with it, right? Passing in these props like that a child might use is completely violating that rule. So that's probably the main hard and fast rule, is that if it feels clunky and if your components feel clunky, that's what's called a code smell. And code smells are these like instincts you kind of get where you're like, oh, this kind of feels weird. I don't really know, but I feel like I'm doing something wrong here. Chances are you might be, right? It's very likely because that's your kind of spider sense as a developer telling you something here is not ideal. I am in Canada right now. I was in Amsterdam, but I moved back to Canada last week, actually. So my girlfriend just got the job in Twitch, so we're actually moving to probably San Francisco at some point. Or she's moving in 2 weeks. I have to figure out what's going on. Yeah, Toronto. Toronto. Yes. I am in Toronto. Let me see. What's another question? Oh, okay, when will I know when I'll be ready for React? And when will I know when I need React for my projects? Okay, that's a great question. This is a really, really good question. And this is actually a very kind of weighted question. With React, React is one front-end library solution amongst many. There are trade-offs to using React, to using Angular, and to using Vue. There are pro-con benefits, and you have to really think about when you want to use one over the other based on your circumstance. You want to use React if the project you're building, you want to bootstrap quickly, and generally speaking, you have a pretty tight-knit team of developers that you're working with that don't necessarily that generally work in a close enough vicinity or they're senior enough. Because with React, it's very easy to write code and solve problems differently from other people. React is really just a front-end rendering library, right? It just helps you render UI components. Redux and all that other stuff is how they tacked on different solutions to solve the other parts of writing a front-end application. If you need to actually consider what it is that you're doing with React, there's a lot of coding and design practices and design principles that you need to look at and you all need to share and know. In that case, it's really easy for code in one place to look different from a code in another when you work on a team with multiple developers. That's the main con. You have to make sure that everybody is unified on how we code our React application. If you're working on a really big application where maybe tens, 20s, 50s of developers are going to be working on it, and they are going to be of varying levels of expertise, then Angular is actually better. Because Angular is extremely, extremely opinionated about how you solve everything. Every single, honestly, 90% of the solutions in all the things in building an application comes with the core Angular library. So they want you to use everything the Angular way. You honestly have to code things the Angular way as well. Everything's pretty enforced. So in that sense, it's really easy because once a developer knows how to code Angular, they can join an application and they look at an application and they pretty much know what to do. They're like, oh, okay, because everything's pretty much the same. It's just the nuances of what you're building are different, but the actual components, the architecture, the structure of the code, that's all Angular. So that's the big thing. Would I mentor one-on-one sessions? I could. It just really depends. If I really can't solve the problem for you online, that would be the thing. My only hesitancy is that there's so many students, and if I offer it to one, then I don't want people to feel left out, right? But if the problem is something that I think will be something that a lot of students might encounter, then maybe there's an easier way for me to help solve these problems. That would be the only thing, right? It's there's just so many students. I just don't want to make anyone feel ostracized. That would be the only thing. Or I'm picking favorites, right? That's the main thing. Advantages of server-side rendering versus client-side rendering. Server-side rendering is more complicated to do. Server-side rendering requires a lot on you to understand about full stack applications. That's probably the main thing. The benefits is the speed. Like, it's really fast and it's really, really performant. And it depends, like, because complexity is probably the main thing. One of the biggest trade-offs you got to think about as a developer is how much complexity is this going to add to my application? Like, is this going to introduce a lot more files, a lot more architectural decisions that I have to make in order to do this? Because if I'm building like a personal blog website, for example, I'm probably not going to need server-side rendering unless I have like really heavy assets, like really big images or something, that take a long time for my browser to download. But generally speaking, client-side rendering in that case is going to have the advantage. Whereas server-side rendering is when you have a really big application where you have a lot of kind of really, like, your application's massive and there's so many pages, so many routes that at that point it just doesn't make sense to have one big chunk downloaded with the initial client bundle. If you guys aren't familiar with chunking, chunking is kind of how client-side rendering optimizes downloading different pages of code that don't need to be displayed yet. So, for example, if we're on our home page, we just need to download everything related to our home page, as well as our application and all dependencies, of course. But once I navigate to the next page, then I only want to download the files, right? Like the JavaScript code related then, because I don't need it now. I only need the stuff related to my home page. So generally, you can get pretty good performance benefits just doing that kind of chunking. And with optimizations like SSR versus client-side rendering, that's a kind of decision that you have to be able to make once you see the scale of what it is that you're building. And a lot of times, like, your stakeholders or your project managers or product managers should be the ones that will kind of tell you this is the scale. And ideally, you have a senior developer that looks at this and is like, holy crap, this is going to be huge. No worries. I'll probably end it in... It depends on the interest. So we've dwindled down to like 36 viewers, probably because it is so long. But I'll probably go for another 15 more minutes. But these are all great questions, right? AWS versus Firebase. I have not used much of AWS outside of hosting. Whereas Firebase, I've mainly used for database and not hosting. So like I kind of like touched different parts of both solutions. So I can't really give you a full answer there, to be honest. Let's see. On a large-scale enterprise application, I'm really concerned that React might not be able to handle sensitive data or state management. So React is actually very, very scalable. And there's lots of design patterns, lots of libraries, and lots of design patterns in those libraries that make it scale incredibly well compared to the solutions that are out there right now, like other solutions that are out there. So that's one big thing, is that with React and Angular, you can generally trust that they are very scalable because the biggest companies in the world all use them. So that's the main thing. Like, if you're worried about React scaling, don't worry about it. It's actually very, very good. You just have to make sure that, like, if you are building an enterprise application, you ideally need to have a senior developer with you because they need to understand a lot of the nuances and the big kind of solutions-oriented problems that enterprise faces. That is going to transcend, like, building, right? Like, that's probably the big thing. Like, right now, there's one principle, very solid principle, that I learned at the company that Andre and I worked at that I think is probably the most important thing. In your life, especially with development, there are going to be things that you know, things that you don't know, and then things that you don't know that you don't know. Those things that you don't know that you don't know are going to be the most difficult and challenging things when it comes to figuring out whether or not this thing is able to be built. Like, when you look at a feature and you're thinking about taking it on, right? You might look at it and already have in your mind a way that you might approach this problem, and you might be able to isolate and think about, like, oh, you know what, that thing that I don't really understand, I think it's small enough that I can figure it out. But once you uncover it, it might be this huge tip of the iceberg where there's like all this stuff related to it that you're like, holy crap, I didn't even know it was like this complex. And that is always why, like, when it comes to development, building applications takes so long. It always goes like way over budget, like 4 or 5 years past expectancy of when it should be delivered because of the process of building applications and mainly because of this problem, right? You have teams of stakeholders, project managers, designers, developers, architects. Everyone is subject to this where you just don't the what you don't know that you don't know will be what screws you. So a lot of what you try to do is just work on the things that you don't know, because once you do more with the things that you don't know, it will uncover more of the things that you didn't know into things that now you're aware, oh, I don't know that, right? Because the worst thing you want is to just be completely unaware of this thing. Like you don't even know that it exists, right? That it in some way is going to impede you solving this problem. That's probably the biggest thing to keep in mind, I find, as a developer, so that you don't get overwhelmed. Because burnout is real, right? Especially in JavaScript. JavaScript changes so fast, and people are always telling you constantly that this is going to be the next big thing. This is a thing that you need to know now, right? Like, it's overwhelming how many voices there are trying to push on you new libraries, new technology, whatever, right? And that's just human nature. But that thing in itself will, like, it's a challenge in that sense, right? And you got to be able to drown that out and figure out what's the right thing for you to work on at this time. And that is largely also a personal journey, and there's no like hard fast rules about that, but there's also like a side of it where you got to manage your own mental health, right? Because getting discouraged and being overwhelmed, those are all really realistic things. Let me see. I want to know if we can build complex backend applications with React like Data Scraper. Wait, sorry. I know we go over Firebase and things for logins, but were you to add a full-fledged inventory system into this app, SQL or NoSQL? So SQL and NoSQL, those will get handled by Firebase. They use NoSQL in order to manage the actual data in the Firebase. But we don't do that much backend here. We will build an Express server though, because in order to fully process a Stripe payment, you have to have an Express server that actually makes the request. And like that's a thing that you guys will learn in this course. I try and keep it as easy and as simple as possible. But it's not that much backend. Like backend is an entirely different beast. There was actually somebody that asked me a question in the discussion of the week about building. Let me just see. I think it was about building something with the backend as well, like with React. And it's like that's like a full stack thing, and that's like a whole another animal, right? Full stack, like backend is really an entirely different practice. You might end up you code JavaScript, but there's no views, right? Like you're not rendering anything unless you're building server side rendered with like Next.js or something like that. But generally speaking, that's an entirely different framework that operates on React. But backend stuff, I try to leave as much of it out as possible because you don't really need it to know React at all. Other than the Stripe payment thing. Let me see. Is there any more questions? Do we need to know about symbols to learn React Saga? No, you don't. You don't need to know about Saga. You don't need to know about symbols. Yeah, okay. I think that's all the questions, actually. So if anybody has any other questions... Oh, actually, no, sorry. There was one about solid principles. Okay, so that's actually a very theoretical question about building React with solid architecture. You can, and you, quite frankly, you will with the best practices that you learn in this course. The thing is that in this course, if you if you want your application to really follow solid principles with React, you have to have a really high degree of separation, which, quite frankly, when learning React for the first time is super overwhelming. Like, if you have to learn how to separate everything that way, it's really hard to learn um, how React actually works while trying to, follow this paradigm. And if you guys are curious about solid, like, you can Google it. It is actually easier to implement with something like Angular because by default they try and follow those principles than with React. And it's fully possible. It's just whether or not that trade-off is worthwhile given the state of the team you join, right? And also your own personal point in learning. But yeah. Okay, so there's 6 minutes left. I can answer any other remaining questions if anyone has any. I know that Justin put a bunch inside of the chat, but I don't remember if I answered all of these or not. So if anybody has any other questions, please just ask them in the chat, and I will definitely try to get to them. Cool. Okay. All right. It looks like there's no more questions. Wait, sorry. General stack use. Wait, general full stack? General tech stack. Sorry, what's the question here? Oh, no, for Andre's course. Yes, Andre's course is really good. Andre's course covers almost all the concepts that you need. The zero to mastery, junior to senior. There's so many concepts that he covers there that like it gives you a really good theoretical landscape of what it is that you need to know. What will be the next additions to the React course? So there will be. Okay. So we're going to introduce GraphQL, context API, performance, progressive web applications. There's going to be more advanced Firebase in terms of some other features. The thing is that like there's so much you can build on from this base application, right? Like there's all these things that you can now add to your application if you want to, because all the principles you're going to learn are going to give you the confidence to look at a library and say, you know what, I think I can bring this in, right? Because it'll teach you at the very least like how the React architecture is going to work, so that when you look at something like, say, you want to introduce toasts, right, to your application, like those little messenger things that pop up, you can find a library that you like, look at the documentation, and then you can generally figure out where in your application you should put this new feature, so that your architecture still stays clean, everything's still really readable. You'll understand yourself as well how to implement like a different feature if you wanted to. Like if for example you did want to add like comments and reviews, right? You are completely equipped with all the experience you need to actually figure out how to build this in. So what I might do with the course is like I might just build the feature. Like I would issue a challenge, right? Like based off of the final application you've built, let's build in X. And what I'll do is I'll show you guys like maybe one, like the setup for it or the start for it that you guys might not know, like regarding using a library. But then I'll ask you guys to build it out, and then I'll give you guys a full repo where everything is solved with it already. So that's kind of the approach I take with some of these later sections of the course, is we convert and so we'll learn this new library. and we'll convert some of it over, and then I'll ask you guys, like as a challenge, to do the remaining components yourself. And then what I'll do is I'll supply you guys with a GitHub repo where I've converted everything. So you can look at it and use it as a reference. Because if you guys, like, for example, watched me convert the entire application over to using styled components, which is CSS and JS, then you'll find that you'll just be watching me code CSS for like an hour and a half, right? And it's not really that interesting because you're learning the exact same things over and over again. Exactly. So that's really those are kind of things that I've got. I've actually got a lot of kind of smaller features like that. Um, that exactly what you're talking about. Kind of like new additional extra features that you can build on top afterwards. The only thing is that we had to cut some of this content just because like a lot of it was redundant in terms of what you can learn. But if you guys want, like, I can totally, put that, like, that's totally available for everybody, right? It's 100% something we can add. It's just you might not get that much learning out of it, but it might be really cool if you guys want to build something like that. Yeah, so that was one thing that Andre really stressed as well, was that like React is so complex in itself, and CSS is just like an entirely different thing. I'm just going to provide everybody with all of the CSS. So that's right. That's what I did. I just gave you guys all the CSS, and I figure that way as well. If you guys wanted to learn CSS, like I at least provided you guys with some CSS. So if you're like, oh, that's cool, I wonder how he does that, then you can just look up the rules that I've written, and then you can kind of learn CSS that way, which is like one of the best ways of learning. Okay, guys. So thank you guys for partaking in this AMA. Give me any feedback if you, regarding the AMA. If you guys want me to do this again, maybe it should be more structured, a different way. I know this was a little bit unstructured because it was the first time I did such a thing. But if you guys have any questions or any kind of recommendations or constructive feedback, I'd love to hear it. Whatever is best for you guys, I am 100% on board for. So thank you guys again for supporting the course. All right, I'm completely blown away by everybody's support, your eagerness, and honestly, whatever I can do for you guys, please message me, ask me questions, and I will get to it as soon as I can. Thank you guys, and cheers.